Hey everyone, we're going to talk about how you can supercharge your mapping apps with Gatsby. So who am I? I'm Colby Fayok. I'm the one hugging BB-8 and Kylo Ren here. I work on the UX and front-end side of things at Element84. You can find me pretty much anywhere by just googling my name, as I'm the only one in the world. So let's look back a year ago, or really even 6 months ago for those of us who are lucky enough to get out. We were all able to safely go out to restaurants, meet up with friends and family, or even grab a bite alone. I don't think that any of us expected 2020 would be the year that we'd meet a pandemic. I know I expected 2020 to be the best year ever. But that's realistically what happened. Stores and restaurants started shutting down just because they couldn't support the decline in business. I lost my favorite Chinese restaurant that used to be at this location, and I was really hoping to get a little bit of the General Tso's before I moved up to Pennsylvania. Luckily, some restaurants were able to sustain themselves. Between apps like Uber Eats and Instacart, we've been able to attempt to have normal lives, but at home. Restaurants have also attempted to offer curbside pickup for themselves, but this could be really hard for business owners, especially if they're not used to fulfilling orders in this way. I saw Josh Bryant from Memphis Web Workers put together this Gatsby app. It collects a list of restaurants in the Collierville, Tennessee area. It helps restaurant owners let people know what services they're still providing. It also helps people know if their favorite restaurant is open. When we're in a situation like this, a little bit of normal is important, and this helps us achieve that. But for someone to use this, they have to know what restaurant they're looking for, or look through all the different pages. They might get their heart set on Bella's Pizzeria, only to find out that it's on the other side of the city. So what if we put a map on this page to help people find the locations that are close to them? But before we get into that, maps can mean a lot of things, right? So what exactly are the kind of maps that I'm talking about? This is a pretty basic example. It's Google Maps showing an overhead look at Philadelphia. But we can do a ton of things with this map. We can search for restaurants or coffee, check out that photo of a turtle, or we can even get driving directions. But maps can get more interesting when you start looking at the data. So for something pretty current, which is why we were going to do Gatsby Days as an online instead of in California, we can take a look at this map from Johns Hopkins University. It shows the number of coronavirus cases around the world. These types of tools are incredibly helpful for anyone trying to study and understand more about the virus. So while we can do some pretty interesting things with maps, how does all this stuff actually work? Getting started probably isn't as bad as you think, so let's break it down a little bit. Mapping applications look like your standard Jamstack app, which is pretty much a static HTML website. But we're using JavaScript in the browser to make any requests to your APIs that would provide dynamic data. The Jamstack concept is pretty much what you're working with out of the box with maps. First, you have the JavaScript that makes the map run. Layered on top of that, you have your APIs. That compiles down to your markup, which the output is your standard HTML and assets, which that ultimately gets served to the person who's using the app. So let's start from the top with JavaScript. Leaflet is a library that brings mapping tools to the web. I like to use the React flavor called React Leaflet. It takes Leaflet and builds out native React components to quickly build maps. Here we have a simple example of a map that we can get from the React Leaflet's homepage. It's a pretty basic map. On top of that, we have a simple marker and a pop-up. Behind that, we're using OpenStreetMap for our base map. So how do we get there? Really, this small snippet is all it takes, so let's break it down. Starting from the top, we have our map component that wraps everything. We set our latitude and longitude using the center prop, and we set our zoom and our zoom prop, which tells our map how far we want to be zoomed into the map. Next, we describe the base imagery layer we want to add to the map. This is called our tile layer. We set that new tile layer using an endpoint URL. We also provide an attribution to give the service credit. So this will give the base of the map, but how do we actually get that marker? This last snippet creates the marker. Using the marker component, we set the position of where we want that marker to be using the latitude and longitude again with the position prop. Inside that, we include a pop-up component, which we can then nest our simple text. And after that, we have our basic map example. So getting to that point isn't too bad, but let's talk about the data that actually goes into building that map. So let's dissect Snapchat's filter creator to walk through the different parts of a map. This tool is used for people who want to create a new filter for Snapchat. It's location-based, so your filter is only available in the location you choose. Beneath all the inputs and the data, we have our base map, and here we have Google Maps. Here we're looking at the streets view, which is some vector drawings, but if we click the satellite view, we can also see the actual satellite imagery. So here we're toggling between the two different base maps to see what we more easily want to use. And as another example, you can't actually change the imagery like this, which is why I'm showing you a poorly hacked together version from Photoshop, which uses ArcGIS data. But say we wanted to find where most of the people lived in our area. We could do an overlay on top of our base map, hence the term overlay. And then we can try to set our filter location for the area that has the most people. That way our filter can be more effective, which this gives us the ability to easily compare other image sources in relation to our underlying base map. And for something that you can actually do with this tool, we can draw a fence around the area that we want our filter to be available in. Here I can select the geofence tool, and I can actually select the area around City Hall in Philly. And this is a geofence. But really what we're looking at is a series of latitude and longitude points that represent a shape. That shape is our data that tells Snapchat that geospatial area that we want our filter to be in. So while it's cool that we can see the map images, the data is really where things start to get interesting, whether it's our population density or that COVID-19 map from earlier. It's how we can really communicate thick data that represents geographic areas in a visual way. Alright, so once we have our map and our data on top of it, we need to compile it down and serve it to the browser. Compiling the app is pretty much what you would expect from anything else built on a Webpack-based app. You can use your favorite tools like Gatsby, which compiles down to a static site, and that outputs HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And once you have that compiled version, you can serve it really anywhere you want to. At that point, it's just object storage. So whether you want to put it in a bucket on S3 or use Azure's new tool, you really have a lot of options. So how is Gatsby an important part of this workflow? Tooling with the front end of the stack is so many things. Insert Webpack in front of each line, then insert the next framework of the week that solves that problem. And while we can get started pretty quickly with a map, it can get a lot more complicated. What Gatsby has allowed us to do is focus on what's important. It means we don't need to spend time building out a front end. We don't need to worry about whether or not that extra Webpack config from the Create React App source is actually important. We can immediately start working on building a map. We can focus on the data, which actually can make a difference. And at the end of the day, tooling isn't productive if it gets in the way. So let's loop back to Collierville Eats. We were talking about how a map could help people get an idea of how far away a location is from their location. So how do we add a map? Well, luckily this is actually even easier than it was 6 months ago. If you haven't heard the buzz, Gatsby released a new feature called recipes lately. So of course I built one for React Leaflet. And since the website was already built in Gatsby, recipes made it super easy to add new functionality to the site. So the first thing I did was run the recipes command using the React Leaflet recipe I created. Once I had React Leaflet and the dependencies installed, I was able to add the coordinates of the location to a few restaurants to test this out. I added a new location property in a few posts where I added the latitude and longitude. Then I added a map component with a marker for each location. And aside from a few lines of data wrangling, that's really the bulk of what I had to do. Now you can actually see where these restaurants are located. Because the data was already being piped in through Gatsby, I was able to simply add that new location property to the GraphQL query. I only added a few for this demo, but this could easily be expanded to all other locations. So what if we wanted to actually build a map from scratch? Let's walk through building an example. I created this demo for this fancy restaurant called Gatsby's. You're not just eating good, you're eating great in the neighborhood. The UI isn't overly complex, we have some images and links. The part we're interested though is this list of locations and these markers on the map. This isn't necessarily super special, we can add a Google Maps widget with low friction, but behind that we're using GraphCMS to manage all these locations. We're pulling them in with GraphQL with Gatsby. And since we're using GraphQL, we're able to create a new page for each of those locations. We have a simple page metadata, but we can also pull in a map so we can show a close-up view of our location. So how do we put this all together? I started out with this Gatsby starter I created for Leaflet. After you run the starter commands, you're already halfway there. We have a relatively simple app going for us with the map. With my app spun up, I wanted to start pulling in the content. For this demo, I went with GraphCMS, mostly because I wanted to try it out. But it actually turned out to be a really great choice because they had this location schema in part of their configuration. This makes it really easy for someone to intuitively select an address and a location to use with our website's map. So with my data, I needed to actually pull it into the app. I was able to use the GraphQL source plugin, which let me pretty easily query for my data. With Gatsby's API, I was able to create a new page for each restaurant based on that data. So now I have a home page and I have a template that I'm able to use for each restaurant page. With my data now available to query through GraphQL, that allowed me to easily pull that data into a page where I can start working it into the map. So at this point, I'm past all the stuff that's usually less unique about an app. Gatsby let me super quickly scaffold a new app with an existing map and easily source some GraphQL from a CMS. From here, we can add our data to the map. And this part actually wasn't too bad. We can map through all of our restaurants and create a data structure for geospatial data. Particularly here, we're using GeoJSON. On our homepage, this allows us to plug our data directly into Leaflet and add all of our restaurants to our map. And that gives us our Gatsby's restaurant page. So while creating a fake restaurant chain is fun, there are real-world projects that are actually making an impact. I'm sure we can all agree that space is pretty cool. And the idea that these machines are floating around in space collecting data is just mind-blowing. But how can we collect that data and make it available in a format that's easy to consume? We're working closely with Capella Space to provide scientists with an easy way to look up and analyze data that Capella has collected with their satellites. Here we're showing a search of San Francisco. we can see the imagery that they have available at this time. This is relevant because this app was built on top of Gatsby. While we don't make use of any of the data flow features like GraphQL like we saw before in GraphCMS, we were able to quickly bootstrap this app and focus on what makes it unique. Once you select one of the search results, you can actually get a closer look and overlay that image on top of the map. This also comes with a big bucket of metadata, which we can only see a glimpse of that here, but that's typically more useful for scientists who work closely with that type of data every single day. The cool part though is if Capella doesn't already have the data that the person wants, like here over Walt Disney World, we provide an interface that lets them actually task these satellites in real time. Once Capella receives that request, they'll utilize the open and close date to capture imagery of the requested area the next time those satellites pass over that area of interest. The UI that I just showed you will allow customers to task a satellite to collect imagery in areas that they're interested in. This kind of thing gets me excited, because connecting the dots here, by working on map tech, we're able to communicate with machines in space, meaning Gatsby is officially helping to do work in space. That still just blows my mind. And we've been learning a lot about mapping through various projects that we've helped build. To try to help share some of that knowledge, we've been working on open sourcing some of that work for others to use. We call it Fog. We built this component library that we're actively using on projects. You're able to quickly get productive with building dynamic maps. The meat of it is this component you see here called Lens. It has a React hook-based search API that allows you to search by location. You can use that to make search requests to an endpoint and manage the state gracefully between the data and the map itself, or even simply change the base layer. The cool thing is we built this as part of a Gatsby theme, so you can plug this in as part of your build process and get all the same benefits that Gatsby provides with themes, which is exactly what we did for the project you see here. We're using Fog to build a mapping UI that lets first responders help manage resources in a disaster scenario. By using these components, we can worry less about the complexities of mapping libraries themselves and focus more on the tool. If you want to check out Fog, you can find it at fog.element84.com or the Element84 GitHub. So did I inspire you to learn a little bit more about mapping apps? Well, if I did, keep an eye on my Twitter and on Egghead. I'll be giving a workshop where I'll teach you how to create your own mapping app. We'll start with a Gatsby app and we'll learn how to manually walk through adding a map with your own data. Details will be announced soon, but in the meantime, I have a bunch of lessons already on Egghead that you can walk through for free today. Apps are a tool that we can sometimes take for granted that can do amazing things. If you want to chat more about mapping apps, definitely reach out to me on Twitter. Otherwise, keep a lookout for more of my tutorials and guides on Twitter or on YouTube. Thanks for watching.